perspectives. So I thought with this one, how many of you have gone to another Critique 101 lecture or might have been? So I thought I would try and focus more on, kind of like take the name and talk about perspectives on critiques, and just talk a little bit about what debate is, what critique debate is, why, sort of, or how to sort of dispel these myths about critique debate versus straight up debate. So, who has ever read a criticism? Like, who's ever run one around? Okay. Who has ever debated a criticism? Okay. So, why don't, and also, I hate the banking concept of education. So instead of just me lecturing to you, I feel like we should just have a conversation. So I know how to help you, and you can learn from me, and I can learn from you. So shout out what do you think a critique is? What distinguishes a critique from other debate arguments, like a dissent or a counterplan? So
I guess it kind of questions the ideas that are behind their argument that they're running.
That's good. Anything else?
I kind of feel like it's kind of a big weighing mechanism as far as the judge goes, saying, this is how we should do things, and this is why the app is wrong and why you should vote no.
Does anyone here not like critiques? Does anyone here love critiques?
I like critiques.
So what do you like about critiques?
Well, they seem to put the other team on the defensive really quick. And as soon as you run the critique, the other team has to burn time addressing the critique.
Okay.
So that makes critiques pretty useful as far as time goes.
So let me throw this out there. I like dissents a lot because they have to spend a lot of time on them, and because they have to answer the dissent before they have to answer anything else. Do you think that still works? In other words, do you think that's something specifically with the critique, or is that just kind of how debate is?
I guess it's kind of how debate is, yeah.
For sure. So this is all kind of just the different perspectives that I'm talking about. So what is a critique and what is a dissent? What is a counterplan? I think there's sort of an overwhelming view, at least that I've seen, growing up as a critique debater, that critiques are cheating, or are for cheaters, or are normally vacuous theoretical things that have no grounding in reality, or they're just calling their team racist for fun. And I think you're right when we talked about it's the underlying things that they're talking about. That is what the critique is based on. The simple definition of a critique is that a critique questions the underlying assumptions behind the other team's methodologies, ethics, performance, representations. Those four are probably good. So critique questions the underlying assumptions behind the other team's the underlying assumptions behind the other team's methodology, performance, ethics, and representations. Who can tell me what any of those four are? Or all of them? Just a quick definition. So methodology. What's methodology?
Or how they their thought, where their mind is kind of in the case, how they plan on solving it. So
Well, yeah, that's the first part of the word, method, right? So what's their method?
By text.
Well, it's sort of just what is the method by which the plan text happens. So the United States federal government will militarily intervene in Syria has a specific methodology of military intervention, right? You're indicting the way in which the plan happens, the mechanisms that the plan uses to get stuff done. Would you say something?
Well, I was just gonna say how they get to their conclusion or their plan or
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so a lot of critiques, you'll see this especially, this is kind of the mainstream view of how a lot of criticisms go down. You'll see it especially with Marxism, is that it questions the methodology of using the capitalist system, right? So the critiques address the methodology, the ethics, the performance, and the representations of the other team. What about ethics?
they're arguing about the economy, you could critique them like, well, it doesn't really matter because a bunch of people are dying.
Okay. Sort of. Because, yeah. Anything else?
Like, your plan text reduces well-being overall. So,
Okay.
yeah.
So the thing with ethical criticisms is that these are normally the ones that are really philosophical, I think, and a lot of them can be kind of wrapped up with this guy Levinas and his train of thought about the relationship with the other, right? So Levinas was this philosopher who said that we should have, like, he talked about having like unconditional obligations to the other and the way that like the self views the other, right? So not just like one person and another, but like a bunch of people and a bunch of people, like nations and nations. It's just about like how you as a person view the other as something outside of yourself. So that's where that's an example where a lot of ethics may come in, because someone can use, you know, that one's always kind of tricky to link. Like it's kind of Levinas is normally pretty tricky to work into a criticism, but like you talk about the ethics by which you do your ath, which yeah, is probably to be more simply defined, how you all did it with, well, you caused people to die, right? Like there's an ethical claim that their ethics is a certain way. They have the ethics of capitalism, right? You can use the same critique in a lot of different ways. So you can, did anyone watch the demo debate that we had? So me and Erwig went for Marx, right? And the links we went for were about the ethics of capitalism. And we didn't really say ethics specifically, but we talked about like the motivation under the bourgeois system is to get profits and to like put all of your negative externalities elsewhere, so you don't have to pay for them, right? So you dump them like in communities of color, or you dump them in the ocean, right? So that is an ethical question. How ethically do you prioritize things under a capitalist system? Because we'd say under a capitalist system, we don't prioritize people of color, we don't prioritize poor people, we don't prioritize women, we don't prioritize the environment. We prioritize the bourgeois and the system in which they've created for themselves. So do you see how these are all still the fundamental assumptions and the questions that they're making? So it's nothing like crazy out of the ordinary. Like critique debate in its simplest is asking a different question. And that's how you should understand all criticisms, is that they're just asking a different question in the F. So we did methodology, we did ethics. Do you remember the other two? Performance. What do you think could we critique about performance in debate? What do we do when we perform in debate? How do we perform debate?
We talk. We speak to each other
How?
through verbal gestures and nonverbals.
But I mean, like, be more specific about what, like, be honest about what debate does. How does debate really communicate?
Rhetoric?
Do we though? What are you gonna say?
Well, I was going to say that, like, debate is kind of two sides clashing against each other and trying to break each other's arguments down.
Exactly. And how does that happen? Like, stylistically, how does that often look like?
Structured speeches.
Sure. So very structured, very fast, very militaristic, very techno-strategic. There's not an emphasis on understanding the other person. There's an emphasis on confusing them so that you can win. In fact, ironically, that's a lot of the reason critiques are seen negatively, is because they are used by people as just a tool of exclusion instead of what they really are, which is a different question in the F, right? So when we debate, we perform different things. The way we act, the way we talk, the speed at which we do all that. And so performative arguments, addressing the performative way in which we debate, would be something like when you read a critique, you read poetry, and then you talk about why debate should focus on linguistics, and and then you talk about why poetry is good and why traditional debate and that just like dissemination of information super fast is problematic. See how that would work? Something that's used a lot, remember at the beginning I talked about the baking concept of education? Does everyone know what that is? Okay, have you heard of Paulo Freire? So he's this dude that he was this Brazilian philosopher, and he created, it's called critical pedagogy. So pedagogy is knowledge, learning, school. And he has a book that's most famous called Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which I'm sure you've at least heard about. It's really good, super easy to read. Like, you can knock out at least like the first chapter in a few minutes, and like, it's really good. But he talked about the banking concept of education. And he basically says that education is like a bank. That we go, we put money in the bank, and then when we need it, we get it right back out. And the same thing happens in our school systems and when we learn things. That we tell you something so you can spit it back out later. Like, we all took the SAT, right? We learned something, we studied, we went there, we wrote all that shit down, and bubbled little things in, we turned in the Scantron, and then we waited in agony until we got the results. Do you ever really retain what you get through standardized testing? I couldn't tell you the first thing that we talked about in the SAT. All I remember is I didn't do that well. But it's the banking concept of education. You put in information so you can spit it back out. Debate does the same thing. Typical, traditional policy debate is the banking concept of education. We write these files and memorize, like we literally memorize like procedurals and things like that just so we can use them, right? So when we're talking about performative elements of critiques, there's definitely a lot to be said that a performative element can be talking about how debate and traditional debate uses that banking concept of education, and why instead you should adopt more of like a student-teacher relationship, which means that the teacher is also a student and the student is also a teacher. So we're having a dialogue and we're talking together and we're learning from each other instead of just one person being like, no, this is what you do. Right, so it's very performative. It's in the way that we structure debate. If you want to know more about stuff like that, I'm teaching a lecture tomorrow on non-traditional debate and performance debate. That's just going to be about that. It's going to be sick. But that's basically the fundamental performative questions that they ask. What was the last one? Methodology, ethics, performance, representations. What are those?
How the other team, like, carries themselves, or carries their case, I guess, like, I feel like it kind of goes on with the methodology, like.
All of these are overlapping to an extent, by the way.
Like how everything kind of like just comes together.
Right. So the stories that they tell, the ways that they frame things, the representations that they say. So when people say stuff like realism inevitable, or capitalism's good, or military intervention's inevitable, or war's inevitable, racism's inevitable, patriarchy's inevitable. All stuff that's said before, some of which I've actually said before, right? And that's normally how people answer critiques. A good strat against a critique normally is to say this is inevitable, so we should perm and include the alt in our plan so we can try and work towards making it less so. What's a representation behind saying patriarchy is inevitable? Do you know what patriarchy is?
Yeah.
Okay. So what is the representation behind saying something like that? It's kind of shitty, right?
In a way, you're kind of just like giving up and saying,
Yeah, it's sort of
gonna
just like,
happen anyways.
It's like a fatalist, dude.
it's a big problem, so I guess we can't do anything. Like, the representation behind the way that you frame things, or especially with things like realism good, cap good, war good, like intervention good, like those arguments, especially those impact terms, have very clear representations that you should include in your criticism. Now, oftentimes, those won't come out till the MG, but you should adopt those as new links in the MO. Does that make sense? So if you're questioning the representations that someone talks about, Or even if someone reads that on the app, like, I remember reading an app a while ago about the U.S. should militarily intervene in Syria, and our app was to send, because my partner back then was like, knew way too much about like the military and the economy and stuff. It was a dark time in everyone's lives. And we went for like, this one specific special operations squad will assassinate Bashar al-Assad. And we went for like, covert assassination's good and things like that. And so like, pretty good example of like, okay, what are our representations? Like, killing homie in his sleep is a good idea, is what we were saying. Assassination's good. Can we think of some problems with that representation?
Well, I mean, if everyone adopted that mindset, it would be quite a problem because they just be, I
Yeah.
don't know, trying to kill each other.
Also, who in this case is the one to be assassinating? United States federal government. What do you think is problematic about the representation of legitimizing the United States federal government's right to commit assassinations against whoever they think is a threat? Ask Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X about that. Like, ask Anwar al-Awlaki what he thinks about that. Legitimizing the state's ability to commit assassinations against whoever they want is a very fucked up representation. And so in this case, remember, it's similar to like methodology and ethics and all these things, but like, it's a little different. It's about like the way you represent something and what you say is underneath that. So there's methodology, there's ethics, and there's performance, and there's representations. That all goes up into the criticism. Any questions about that?
Can you explain the delineation between performance and representations as it applies to like diction?
What do you mean diction? Like,
word choice?
I mean, so like at some level they're all interconnected, right? Because like their representation is also performance. But when we talk about performance in debate, it typically refers to the use of non-traditional, non-traditional speech acts. As in like, I'm going to read a poem or a narrative, or my partner and I are going to recite this theatrical piece, right? So it's different than just the representations you use, it's like the way in which you choose to frame the debate and the way in which you choose to, like, who you are as a debater in the round. Any questions about all this? So what is the critique, basically? At its basic, what is the critique? We just talked about this. It's a different what?
It's a different question.
Right. And what is the different question?
Depends on which kind of critique you want to run.
Well, but like, what do they all have in common?
Questioning the underlying assumptions.
Exactly. So that's really all it is. And I know a lot of people, when they grow up hearing about critique debate, they just view it in sort of these terms of like, oh, I hit this critique and it was super hard to understand, I didn't get it, and they read all this philosophy and they didn't slow down. And for a large amount, for sure. Critiques are used in some level to be exclusionary, just like every debate argument is. But I think the wrong way to go about this is to think that the critique is some crazy, far out left thing that you have to understand so you can defeat, and just realize it's just an argument. You know? Like, what's an econ dissat? Economy is good now. You do something, that makes the economy bad. Okay. So what's a capitalism shell? Here's the capitalist system. You do this, that increases the hold, which makes things like poverty happen. Right? Like, granted, one of those examples is probably a lot more nuanced and complex than the other, but they're both still just questions. Because all this comes down to net benefits. And who can tell me what that means?
Who benefits more? Like who has a bigger range of people getting affected by this?
Mm.
And like what's a higher quality of benefit or quality of life that they're going to receive from it?
Any other definitions? I talk about net benefits a lot. What is it? What does it mean when people say you'll evaluate this through the lens of net benefits?
It's like both sides have good things, it's just whatever case does both the best or gives the best advantage.
I think you're both right, but I think it's important to ground it in the resolution and the affirmative. So I think here's what debate is. I mean, like we talked a lot about like the role of the ballot being whoever debates the best. I think honestly the role of the ballot is the affirmative a good idea or not? Is it a good idea? Is voting app a good idea? That doesn't mean the app has to defend the resolution at all. That just means the app speaks first, speaks last, is typically seen an affirmation with the topic, which is where we all prep for. When we talk about debates, we were like, oh, remember when we had that Syria debate? Oh, remember, oh, how weird was it yesterday that we had 2 Palestine rounds, right? The focus on the resolution. I think there's a lot to be said for the centrality of being affirmative, that you're central. So then, is the app a good idea or not? And that's where you get into cost versus benefits. That's where you get into the disads. It's also where you get into the critiques. Because critiques are also just saying, is the app good or not? Because it's not a good idea if it re-entrenches, you know, the USFG's ability to assassinate enemies of itself. Just like it's not a good idea if it hurts the economy. Like there's no divide between the critical lens that we put on things and the mainstream political lens that we put on things. It's only a choice of the way in which we see the round and the questions we choose to ask. So just because there are questions that are different doesn't necessarily mean that their questions are illegitimate. Any questions about all of this? So, if I go like too fast or want me to explain anything, please just like let me know. Because like I'm just gonna assume with like nods and people just on Facebook that like you're set to go. So there are a few types of critiques, and I think there's like 2 different schools of thought within critique debate. One of them is philosophical, and the other is liberatory. So the 2 main schools of thought within critical debate are philosophical thought and liberatory thought. What do I mean by philosophical? I'm self-explanatory, but like, shout out an example of that. So probably the critique debate you hate the most. The very postmodern, post-structuralist, even stuff you probably haven't debated yet, but things that rely on critical theory and from specific philosophers who give you the argument.
So like Zizek stuff?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So what's Zizek's main argument? Or like Zizek basically takes Marx and takes Hegel and reinterprets them through Lacan, right? And looks at like the psychoanalytic ways in which capitalism asserts itself on our lives. And he has a lot more arguments too, but like that's kind of his main focus, that he's a Lacanian Marxist. Who knows who Lacan is? Yeah. Jacques Lacan is a French psychoanalyst. Don't worry if you don't know who he is. It's not that big of a deal. But when we talk about reading Zizek, you're talking within a specific philosophical tradition and a very specific like history of what that person's saying. So like you have to know like who Zizek is. Like you know he like ran for president in like wherever he's from, and he lost because he just went over everyone's heads. And you know he has traditions like he studied under Lacan and things like that, and like he has all these influences by all these different philosophers, and that all inform his thought, right? Same thing with Lacan, you know, and so people often categorize these critiques by just saying who the author is. Oh, last round we read Derrida. Okay, well what is that? Well, Jacques Derrida was a French linguistic theorist, basically, who talks about the way that words have meaning and difference and how words and like the difference between like what a word is and what a word means, like it's very linguistic based. They read Baudrillard. What's Baudrillard? Well, if you ask me, the rantings of like an angry white man doesn't really make a lot of sense. I don't like Baudrillard. But it talks about simulations that we create. So every single person has different theories. We read Marx. What does Marx say? Marx says this, Marx says that. Very philosophical. Who's just like totally repulsed by that idea? No? What do you think about that?
Which idea?
Like just the whole thing of like very philosophically focused criticisms. Does that sound like a good time?
Yeah, sounds good to
It's
me.
pretty tight.
I mean, not necessarily to hit them, but it's still interesting ideas.
It's cool to read them and run them yourselves, but
Yeah, or just have like,
I mean, yeah, it's kind of a two-edged sword. Like, if you debate them, you don't know the author. Like, shit can get kind of difficult. But at the same time, it's pretty cool. Like, reading these authors for your own and being able to learn who they are and things like that. So, the most, I'd say those probably represent a significant amount, probably like 60% or so, maybe 70% of the critiques that you will see typically. And that's why critiques normally have such a bad name, is because people just like read unintelligible shit, and then people are like, oh, those critique debaters are just, they're philosophy, why can't they just read a dissad, right? So that is a very specific field within critical debate. Do you remember what the other one was?
liberatory.
Liberatory. What do you think that means? What does the word liberatory mean?
Like transcending oppression.
Close. I don't think transcending is the right word, but overcoming.
Sure. Synonyms.
What else do you think liberatory means? What is liberation?
To be free from constraint.
Okay. Liberty. What else? I'm not asking for like a crazy like the right answer. I just want to know what you think. Any ideas on what liberation means? So there's that element of like overcoming and like freeing yourself from something. We talk about people have been liberated, or they liberated themselves. They haven't gone from a state where they're not free to where they are free. And in this case, that freedom is based on issues of structural oppression. Racism is a structure that has chains on everybody. The problem is, well, most people. The problem is that for some people, it's sort of just like a bracelet, and for some people, it's like steel chains wrapped around them. Right? Like, for a lot of people, it's just like, oh, like, I have this little bracelet just kind of reminds me, just like, oh yeah, by the way, that racism thing, like, that's whatever. And some people, it's like, I can't move. Like, if I try and walk, I'm going to fall over. Like, I'm chained. So what does liberation look like?
Unlocking the chains.
Exactly. You're able to break those chains. And so that weird metaphor I just came up with is an explanation of what these criticisms do. They focus on the social situations that keep us in structures and cycles of violence and oppression. And they seek to liberate us from that. So you'll hear a lot of kind of an older roll of the ballot argument that I still have a more little place in my heart, is about the liberation of the oppressed. The roll of the ballot is to vote for the team that creates the best methodology for the liberation of the oppressed. That's what I read. So what does that mean? Creates the best methodology for the liberation of the oppressed. So methodology is how you do something. So what does the entire thing mean?
The team that provides the best way to kind of reduce oppression as much as possible.
I think so. Yeah. And that can be in a lot of things. That can be in, like, on all sides of the spectrum, that can exist. That can be through engaging in forms of political resistance, resisting through occupations, through protests, through sit-ins, things like that, defending sort of like classical protest politics, which is pretty dope. Or it can be like the United States will reauthorize the Violence Against Women Act. Probably also an excellent idea for the liberation of the oppressed, right? Especially with the reauthorization that includes trans individuals and extends protection over Native reservations. Just like, yes, Native women are raped disproportionately high by American men. That should be covered. So it can be at the state, it can be at the individual, it can be a lot of things, but the focus is on creating a method for helping unshackle people that are chained from these structural issues. I should also probably throw out that this is basically a Venn diagram. You know what that is? Like two circles and like the space in between. Like, that's probably how critical debate always is. Like, there are probably no dualities. So like something like capitalism, you know, like Marxism. Very theoretical, could also be very liberatory. Probably both. I don't know. Something like when you get into even like if you think about it, people like critical race theorists and feminist scholars are very much philosophical too. Like you get into even someone like Bell Hooks, who's very well known, has very specific liberatory. She comes from a very specific liberatory place, but she also infuses that with very philosophical tradition. Judith Butler, also a great example of this. Talking about queer theory, talking about gender, very theoretical, but also grounds it in what's actually happening. So these are not like different camps, but these are kind of different ways that you can engage. So under liberatory, can you give me an example of anything you've seen or you know about that you think would fit under this? Any critiques? For sure.
Or Brandon and Nick's whiteness.
What?
Brandon and Nick's whiteness.
Okay. Whiteness, for sure. So let's take that example.
Okay.
So this wasn't their framework, but let's assume they're talking about the methodology for the liberation of the oppressed. What was their method?
Abolishment.
Abolition. So for those of you that don't know, Brandon Rivera and Nick Stump at NAU last year, at NPTE and NPDA, ran a project that they made it to semis at NPTE. They took third overall. That talked about their alt was about the abolition of white debate, and they talked about the way that whiteness creates knowledge and the way the debate community replicates that whiteness. And it was really cool. You can find a lot of videos online if you just look up NAU NPTE 2013 or 2014? 2014.
14.
Yeah. And really cool stuff about like abolitionism and why we need to abolish whiteness and like you're with us or you're against us. Like a very much like you need to like abolish these things as opposed to like work within the system. So you see that methodology for the liberation of the oppressed there? Then it becomes an issue of like, do you work within the system to try to change it or do you abolish it? So that goes back a lot to what we were talking about the methodologies and that underlying question. But fundamentally, they're talking about the liberation of the oppressed from the system of whiteness and debate. Any questions about all that? So, I don't know, like, I just always like that, like, interpretation of critical debate as one that's liberatory. Like, I I think everyone in here has their own specific views. I'm not going to say like you should do one thing or another, but like I think there's a lot to be said for the liberatory ways we engage in debate. Like my biggest inspirations, like the people that inspired me most, were people that came from this perspective of liberatory politics. So the best debates I've ever had have been focused on these issues. I just think it's useful to kind of ground these things in sort of our personal relationship with them, and to come from a place that's genuine and authentic. And I think it's difficult to do that when you're kind of covering everything in like very theoretical post-structuralist shit. And I like that. I'm all about that. Derrida's the homie. But like, at the same time, there's something about liberation that I think is uniquely valuable. And even if we're just talking about it, even just talking about it is, I think, able to create shifts in consciousness in ways that like just memorizing econ disads aren't. That's just my little rant. Any questions about debate or about critical debate overall? Do you see how it's all just different questions? Like it's not that complicated, you know. It can be very complicated, but so can politics disads. Like it's not this crazy, hard to decipher, like unintelligible strategy of excluding you. It can be. It is a lot of the time, but it shouldn't be. It's just asking a different question. One more time, who can tell me what the basic definition of critique is? Without looking. What does it do?
Ask different questions.
Okay, for sure.
Underlying assumptions of the act.
And can you tell me the 4 different things that is? 4 different.
Performance, ethics, methodology, and
Representations. Yeah. So it interrogates the underlying assumptions made by the other team. That's the definition it's been since the first time the critique was ever run in debate, and I think that's the definition it will always be. At the end of the day, it questions the underlying parts of it, as opposed to, actually no, never mind, that's not true. But it questions the underlying assumptions of it.
Like, how's that different from, say, topicality, which questions assumptions of interpretations for words?
Because topicality is procedural, which means it is about the procedure of debate. So it's not about the underlying like assumptions, and like assumptions in this case are very like ideological, and the sort of underlying things, underlying representations, underlying performance, underlying methods, underlying ethics, right, of debate, where topicality is not. Topicality is very focused on, are you breaking the rules or not? Any other questions just about critique debate in general before we get a little more specific? Cool. Let's talk now about framework. I don't think we're going to get through all the parts of the critique, but I think there's a few things we should get through. So what's framework?
it's like the structure of the critique. It's got like a few different parts to it that pretty much talks about like, hey, this is what we should look at, and this is what like the issues we have.
Okay. So just quickly, do you know what the 5 parts of a critique are? Framework, thesis, links,
Impacts and alt.
impacts, alternative. I don't know if there's solvency. Some people do critical perspectives of the thesis, some people don't do thesis, they just go to links. Herp-a-derp-a-derp. These 5 are like the 5 that I've always seen, and sort of like the 5 standard traditional what a critique is. So the first part of the critique is the framework. What does that mean? What does a framework do?
It allows you to weigh your advocacy against the affirmative.
Right. It allows you to ask the different question. If you get up against a policy F and you read a critique, about language and you don't have a framework, what's problematic about that?
You'll lose on net benefits with the different world.
You can't compare the two
Mm-hmm.
because there's no framework to determine how these different questions are being asked. Assuming they read, a framework, and sometimes you can get away with like that anyway, and like sometimes it's one of those like what we mean. I don't know. It kind of depends on how risky you want to be, but like under policy, what framework are you operating under? Kind of. That's the impacts. But what does everyone say? View this debate through the lens of a policymaker. Okay? And what is a policymaker normally defined as? The state, right? The U.S. federal government, the man. So they're like, you should view this round as the man. You're the U.S. federal government. And that's how you do everything else, right? So you're operating in a policy world under that framework. So under a critical world, what do you have to do?
Not operate as a policymaker.
Hey everybody, maybe we can pretend not to be the United States federal government for once in our lives. Maybe we can admit we're human beings and we're talking to each other. Right? Like, hey, no. You should evaluate this round through this. It's more important. Evaluate this round through language, because you use those words anyway. Right? And the whole role playing is like nonsense. Like, when do you role play, you don't have any personal responsibility, right? Because you just say, oh, I'm U.S. federal government. You can commit genocide and affirm that in a debate round, but then sleep at night because you're like, oh, that was just a debate, that was just a game, I was just role playing, right? Like that moral distancing is probably remarkably fucked. So framework starts with your interpretation of what debate should be. So it's going to be like, first is the interpretation. A very simple one, the negative gets one test of the affirmatives methodology. So our interpretation is that we get to question your methods. The number one, an argument you'll probably hear all the time, if you haven't heard already, bad methodology lead to bad policymaking. So things like segregation or desegregation actually increase segregation because they inflamed racial tension and caused white flight. In the same way that things like the policies in the drug war and stop and frisk actually probably increase the amount of crime and anti-police sentiment because police are out there stopping and frisking every black person they see and beating everyone that speaks up against it. As well as like sentencing laws and things like that and how they bust people of color disproportionately high even though white people do more drugs, right? So bad methodologies lead to shitty policies. Like stop and frisk isn't even an effective, it's not even effective police work. The drug war is not good police work because you're not actually trying to fix things. You're just trying to lock people up. So if there's a bad method, your policy is probably not going to work how you want it to. Which means that even if you want to be a policymaker, if you don't have a good method, your policy is probably shit. Do you see how that's really good for the framework debate as an internal link argument? Or as a link term? As an internal link term? Because even if they win that policymaking is good, you don't get good policymaking unless you have good methodology, which means the critique is a prior question. Did that make sense what I just said? Okay. So that's the different question you're asking. That's saying, we're coming before the AF and we're saying the methods that you use are bad. So it doesn't matter if you think policymaking is good, that's dope. I'm glad, homie, you want to be a policymaker. I don't, but whatever. But if your methods aren't good, it's not going to work, no matter who you are. So that's what the framework does at the top. Is just say, like, here's how you should view the round. Framework also addresses impacts. And here's where you'll hear arguments a lot about systemic versus flashpoint impacts. So a flashpoint impact, I don't know what flashpoint, I think it's like it reminds me of flash flood. like, I don't know if it's like a flood or something, but like, something happens and it's bad. And it's like, boom, and everyone dies. Nuclear war, extinction. Right? Very much just like, that's it. As opposed to systemic impacts. So what's a systemic impact?
Poverty, racism.
Right. So, example. People say nuclear war is bad, and that a nuclear war would cause extinction because nuclear weapons are bad. That's the flashpoint impact. The systemic impact. We tested nuclear bombs in the Marshall Islands, and the indigenous people there gave birth to jellyfish babies with exoskeletons and see-through skin, and those like decided collectively to just stop reproducing because any children they would possibly create would die a horrible, horrible short life. Right? Yes, nuclear weapons are bad for everybody. The systemic part, they dump nuclear waste in native reservations across America because native reservations are structurally poor, because reservations are based on assimilation and genocide of native people instead of actually like, here's a safe place where you can hang out. Which means that poor native communities are forced to buy nuclear waste because they have nothing else to feed their kids. In Toole County, Utah, in which nuclear waste is just put in a barrel. And just a barrel. And it's just in a shed. And there's a chain link fence separating it from the water supply. And how they found traces of nuclear radiation in the water supply these people live on. So you see the difference between flashpoint and systemic? Even with the same things. Yeah, economic collapse, shitty, terrible. But how many economies are collapsed within individual houses of poverty? Every day. And that's where impact comparison and calculus, that's just what impact calculus means, is comparing impacts comes in. Nuclear war is bad. Genocide is bad. Okay, let's say you're reading something like anthropocentrism, which talks about our relationship with the environment. Okay? Someone says extinction's bad. Nuclear war is bad. There's enough literature out there that talks about that there is the equivalent of a nuclear war occurring against animals and against nature when we do things like bulldoze a forest, when we do things like animal testing. Like, we talk about genocide in terms of war killing us all, but we don't talk about like things like the Amazon rainforest, which are like some of the most densely populated places in all of the planet, are just being like mad deforested for resources, and how that's that same destruction of life, right? Or how things like SeaWorld, right? Like the ways that we treat animals are very much based, like very much militaristic, like the same effects of these mad genocides that we talk about. So that's the issue between flashpoint and systemic. And most, pretty much every liberatory criticism, and probably like pretty much, but definitely like basically every criticism you'll ever see talks about systemic impacts coming first. And they'll have reasons for like time frame, magnitude, and probability about what they do. You know, probability, they're happening now, so like, yeah, they'll probably happen again, right? Like time frame, of course they'll happen the soonest because they're already happening, so like, you know, it's already built in the structure of how things work. They're systemic, based in the system. So systemic impacts come first, and that gives you a lot of strategy and a lot of good stuff for your criticism, because then you're able to do things like access things like structural violence, issues like whiteness, white supremacy, patriarchy, ableism, transmisogyny, heteronormativity. These structural forces that you are seeking to liberate yourself from, systemic impacts look at that. We're basically almost out of time. I wish I had more time to go through all the framework. But that's basically the function of how framework works. It asks a different question and allows you to ask a different question by saying that we should instead frame the debate in this way. And it also allows you to explain what impact should be preferable. So critique debate isn't that crazy. It asks a different question. And that question is, what are the underlying assumptions behind the other team's performance methodology, ethics, representations. What are they really saying? Not what's the one A subpoint argument say. Like, not what their link is, but what do they actually say? What are the words that come out of their mouths when they speak, assumably English, but not always English, which is another cool topic that we'll talk about in the performance lecture. That's what critique is. Just criticism. Just saying, maybe we shouldn't always be the government. Maybe there's more options. Maybe the man's wrong about a few things. That's why I like it. Class dismissed. If you have any questions, come talk to me. You know I love